First the Pac-Man eats through a maze of dots, then the Pac-Man heads for the corner spots, then he eats his fill of a power pill.
Only Atari makes the Pac-Man home video game.
Have you played Atari today?
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Player One Start. Today we are going back into the arcade, and we are going to have a look at one of the most popular, most influential, and most iconic arcade games that was ever released. But first, let's go ahead and fire up the arcade. When we were last here, we were reminiscing about the hot summer days back in the early 1980s, when we would try to find activities to cool off from the heat, and one of those activities was going into the arcade. But now the seasons have changed, and it is winter of 1980. Space Invaders is still the arcade leader, raking in the most money, but now the arcades are also filled with ports and variations on the theme. But this winter, there is a new arcade machine that will take America by storm. It was already released to great success in Japan, and it would be met with just as much, if not more, success here in the United States. Today we're going to talk about Pac-Man.
Pac-Man was one of the most iconic games ever created, and is arguably the most popular. When this game came out, there was nothing else like it. Due to the success of games like Space Invaders and the cultural trend of space-themed media in general, arcades were packed with space shooter games. And as popular as these were, though, one game developer believed that there was room for not only another kind of game, but another kind of player in the arcade. And he made it his goal to make a game that would appeal to those that may not like the space shooter games.
After acquiring the struggling Japanese division of Atari in 1974, video game developer Namco began producing its own video games in-house, as opposed to simply licensing them from other developers and distributing them in Japan. Company president Masaya Nakamura created a video game development group within the company and ordered them to study several NEC-produced microcomputers to potentially create new games with. NEC was the leading manufacturer in Japan of computer components and radio equipment in the 1970s. They themselves would actually enter the video game market around the same time, but they would eventually have a large success making home computers in Japan later on in the 1980s. One of the first people assigned to Namco's new division was a young 24-year-old employee named Toru Iwatani. He created Namco's first video game, GB, in 1978, which, while unsuccessful, helped the company gain a stronger foothold in the quickly growing video game industry. The Japanese video game industry had surged in popularity with games such as Space Invaders and Breakout, which led to the market being flooded with similar titles from other manufacturers in an attempt to cash in on the success. Iwatani felt that arcade games really only appealed to men for their crude graphics and violence, and that arcade environments in general were seen as seedy environments. This was also a belief held by many Americans, as seen in this news report from 1982.
Boston has become the victim of an electronic blight. With fewer than 600,000 people, the city has 4,000 to 5,000 video games, not just in arcades, but also in drugstores, pizza parlors, supermarkets. Officials say they are responding to complaints from parents that children have skipped school or stolen money to play the games and made a nuisance of themselves.
When they don't have something to do, when they're walking the streets, that's when problems are created, not because of machines. The lack of machines causes problems.
You're always talking about this demeaning making kids' minds like vegetables. Talk about them out on the streets smoking pot.
One MIT study of more than 800 video game players found no basis in fact for an underlying fear expressed by parents during public hearings that video games lead to violence.
But one of the goals with Pac-Man was to change that perception. For his next project, Iwatani chose to create a non-violent, cheerful video game that appealed mostly to women, as he believed that attracting women and couples into arcades would potentially make them appear to be much more family-friendly environments. Iwatani has stated that he began thinking of things that women like to do in their spare time. He decided to center his game around eating, basing this on his belief that women like to eat desserts and other sweets. The game was initially called Pac-Man, based on a Japanese term referencing the mouth movement of opening and closing in succession. The game began development in early 1979 and took about a year and 5 months to complete, the longest ever for a video game up until that point. Iwatani enlisted the help of 9 other Namco employees to assist in the production. To make the game appeal to a non-violent audience, they decided to use a simple gameplay method and cute, attractive character designs. When the game was being developed, Namco was also designing Galaxian, which utilized a then-revolutionary RGB color display, allowing sprites to use several colors at once, instead of using colored strips of cellophane, which was commonplace at the time. This technological accomplishment allowed Iwatani to greatly enhance his game with bright pastel colors, which he felt would help attract more players. Another influence on the game came from the cartoon character Popeye the Sailor Man. In the cartoon, Popeye temporarily acquires superhuman strength after eating a can of spinach. This translated in the game as being the large dots that Pac-Man would consume to be able to eat ghosts. Iwatani has stated many times in interviews that the character of Pac-Man himself was designed after the shape of a pizza with a missing slice while he was at lunch, though this has later been clarified that that was not the entire inspiration for the character. The 4 ghosts were made to be cute, colorful, and appealing, utilizing bright pastel colors and expressive blue eyes. Ghosts were chosen as the game's main antagonists due to them being used as villainous characters in animation. The idea for fruit bonuses was based on graphics displayed on slot machines, which often used symbols such as cherries and bells. Originally, it was suggested that all of the ghosts be red, and thus they would be indistinguishable from one another. However, Iwatani believed that the ghosts should be different colors. Each of the ghosts were programmed to have their own distinct personalities to keep the game from being boring. Each ghost's name gives a hint to its strategy for tracking down Pac-Man. Shadow, the red ghost, always chases Pac-Man. Speedy, the pink ghost, always tries to get ahead of him. Bashful, the cyan ghost, uses a more complicated strategy to zero in on him. And lastly, Pokey, the orange ghost, alternates between chasing him and running away. When the ghost names are directly translated into English, they translate roughly to Chaser, Ambusher, Fickle, and Stupid. However, the ghosts' English names take away the hints used to identify their behavior, being named Blinky, Pinky, Inky, and Clyde. To break up the tension of constantly being pursued, humorous intermissions between Pac-Man and the ghosts were added that would play between certain levels. The sound effects were among the last things added to the game. Upon completion, the game was titled Puck-Man, based on the working title and the title character's distinct hockey puck-like shape. Location testing would begin on May 22, 1980 in Tokyo. A private showing of the game was done in June, followed by a nationwide release in July. After seeing the game's success in Japan, Namco initialized plans to bring the game to the international market, particularly in the United States. Before showing the game to North American distributors, Namco made a number of changes to the game. The biggest change to the game would be the game's title. Various sources state that this was changed to Pac-Man for the North American release due to the fact that vandals would probably have too much fun changing the first letter of his Japanese name. Namco actually presented Pac-Man with another game, Rally X, to potential distributors at the 1980 AMOU trade show in November. It was thought that Rally X would be the best-selling game of that year. Midway Games would agree to distribute both games in North America, announcing their acquisition of the manufacturing rights on November 22nd and releasing the following month in December of 1980.
So Pac-Man itself is a very simple game to play. There's only one control that you need to worry about, and that's the multi-directional joystick. Other than that, it's just move around, there's no really shoot button, and Combining that with a strong, vibrant color scheme, I think is what was very key to this game's success.
Pac-Man itself is a maze chase video game. The player controls the title character through an enclosed maze. The objective of the game is to eat all of the dots placed in the maze while avoiding the 4 colored ghosts that pursue him. Eating a certain number of dots in a level will cause a bonus item to appear, usually in the form of fruit. These can be eaten for extra bonus points. When all the dots are eaten, the player advances to the next level. If Pac-Man makes close contact with a ghost, he will lose a life. The game ends when all the lives are lost. As previously stated, each of the 4 ghosts have their own unique, distinct artificial intelligence, or personalities. Anyone wishing to master the game must recognize these patterns and be able to confront them. Placed at the 4 corners of the maze are large flashing energizers, or power pellets. Eating these will cause the ghost to turn blue with a dizzied expression and reverse direction. Pac-Man can eat the blue ghosts for points, and when eaten, their eyes make their way back to the center box of the maze, where the ghosts are regenerated and resume their normal activity. Eating multiple blue ghosts in succession increases their point value. After a certain amount of time, the blue color ghosts will flash white before turning back to their normal selves. The game's difficulty increases as the player progresses. The ghosts become faster, and the power pellet effect decreases in duration, to the point where all the ghosts will no longer turn blue and edible. To the sides of the maze are 2 warp tunnels, which allow Pac-Man and the ghosts to travel to the opposite side of the screen. Ghosts become slower when entering and exiting these tunnels. The level you're on is indicated by the fruit icon at the bottom of the screen. In between levels are short cutscenes featuring Pac-Man and Blinky in humorous comical situations. The game does not have a solid ending, however it becomes unplayable at the 256th level due to an integer overflow that affects the game's memory.
Pac-Man is a game that continues to challenge me even to this day. It's one of those games where you have to play it for a while to get good at it. But if you don't play it for a while, you kind of lose some of your skill. And I'm not that great at it, but I still love to play it. And that's my opinion today. But the reception it got back in the 1980s was unreal.
When Pac-Man was first released in Japan in the arcades, Pac-Man was only a modest success. Namco's own Galaxian had quickly outdone the game in popularity, presumably due to the large male player base being familiar with its shooting gameplay, as opposed to Pac-Man's cute characters and maze chase theme. Iwatani claims that the game was very popular with women, which he had hoped to accomplish during the game's development. By comparison, in North America, Pac-Man became a nationwide success. Within 1 year, more than 100,000 arcade units had been sold, which grossed more than $1 billion in quarters. Pac-Man overtook Asteroids as the best-selling arcade game in the country, and it even surpassed Star Wars: A New Hope, which was a benchmark for a blockbuster success back in the 1980s, as it was the highest-grossing form of any media that had ever been released up until that point. By 1982, it was estimated to have over 30 million active players across the United States. The large player base would prompt arcades to purchase entire rows of Pac-Man arcade cabinets. And by 1982, the number of arcade units sold had exploded to 400,000 units, receiving an estimated total of 7 billion quarters. But that would not be the only avenue that Pac-Man would use to make money. At that same time, Pac-Man-themed merchandise sales had also exceeded $1 billion. A wide variety of Pac-Man merchandise was marketed with the character's image, including toys, t-shirts, handheld video game imitations, pasta, and cereal. Pac-Man, the animated TV series produced by Hanna-Barbera, aired on ABC from 1982 to 1983. The Buckner and Garcia song Pac-Man Fever went to number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100 charts and received a gold certification for more than 1 million records sold by 1982, and a total of 2.5 million copies sold as of around 2008. In 1982, Weird Al Yankovic recorded a parody of the song Taxman by the Beatles, retitling it Pac-Man. While the single was unreleased for many years, it was eventually released in 2017 as part of a compilation called The Complete Works of Weird Al Yankovic. Milton Bradley released a board game based on Pac-Man in 1982, allowing players to move up to 4 Pac-Man characters, plus 2 ghosts as per the throws of a pair of dice. In a 1983 interview, Namco's CEO Nakamura said that though he did expect Pac-Man to be successful, he never expected how big it would turn out to be.
Pac-Man really took America by storm. It became a cultural icon and was familiar to most Americans, not just gamers, all seemingly overnight. To this day, Pac-Man merchandise still sells. But as with all arcade games, by 1982, gamers were chomping at the bit for a home port, and what would follow would both delight and disappoint.
After Pac-Man proved to be a success in the United States, Atari decided to license the game and produce it for its 2600 console. Programming was assigned to Ted Fry, who was not provided with any arcade design specifications to work from and had to figure out how the game worked by playing it. He would work 80-hour weeks over 6 months developing the game. The finished product uses a 4KB ROM cartridge, which was chosen due to its lower manufacturing costs compared to the 8KB bank switch cartridges, which had only become recently available at the time of its development. As with other arcade ports of the time, the Atari 2600 hardware was a considerable limitation. The arcade system board for Pac-Man contained 2 kilobytes of main RAM in order to run the program, along with 2 kilobytes of video RAM to store the screen state, and a 16 kilobyte ROM to store the game code. Comparing that with the 2600, it only had 128 bytes of RAM, and none of it was dedicated to video. The Zilog Z80 CPU microprocessor used in the Namco Pac-Man arcade machine is clocked at 3 times the speed of the MOS 6507 CPU inside of the Atari 2600, though the Z80 does typically do less work per cycle. To deal with these limitations, Fry simplified the maze's intricate pattern of corridors to a more repetitive pattern. The small tan pellets of the original arcade game were changed to rectangular wafers that shared the wall color on the Atari 2600. This change was necessary because both the pellets and the walls were drawn with the 2600 playfield graphics, which have a fixed width. To achieve the visual effect of the wafers disappearing as Pac-Man eats them, the actual map of the maze was updated as the data was written onto the playfield registers, excluding those pellets which had been eaten. The 2600's player missile graphics system, or sprites, were used for the remaining objects. The 1-bit wide missiles were used for the flashing power pills and the center of the vitamin. Pac-Man and the Ghosts were implemented using the 2600's 2-player objects, with one being dedicated to Pac-Man and the other being used for all 4 ghosts. The result of which was that the ghost only appears once out of every 4 frames, which creates a flickering effect. This effect takes advantage of the slow phosphorescent fade of CRT monitors and the concept of persistence of vision, resulting in the image lingering longer on screen once it has disappeared. But the flickering remains noticeable and makes each individual ghost's color nearly impossible to determine. Fry chose to abandon plans for a flicker management system to minimize the flashing, in part because Atari didn't seem to care about the issue in order to get the game quickly released. According to Fry, the game also does not conform to the arcade's color scheme simply to comply with Atari's home product policy that only space games should have black backgrounds. Fry states that within Atari there were no negative comments about these issues, but after seeing the game, Ray Kassar, Atari's then president and CEO, was informed that enthusiasts might not want to play it due to these differences. This opinion was quickly dismissed, and the company ran newspaper ads that promoted the product in its catalogs, describing it as differing slightly from the original. To help sales, Atari promoted and protected its exclusive licensing of Pac-Man and took legal action against companies that released clones similar to Pac-Man. One such famous lawsuit was a lawsuit against Philips for its 1981 Magnavox Odyssey 2 game, KC Munchkin. However, they failed to stop other games, such as Online Systems' Jawbreaker and Gobbler. Several retailers assisted Atari with the release of the game, with JCPenney being the first retailer to launch a nationwide advertising campaign on television for the software title. Continuing a long-standing relationship between it and Sears, Atari also produced Pac-Man cartridges under the department store's label. Anticipating high sales, Atari produced over 1 million copies for its launch and held a National Pac-Man Day on April 3, 1982 to help promote its release. In the end, this game still stands as the best-selling Atari 2600 game of all time, selling more than 7 million copies. Despite its commercial success, Pac-Man was blasted by critics for its poor visuals and sound, as well as bearing very little resemblance to the original game. And still to this day, many would include it on one of the worst video games ever made due to its poor resemblance to the arcade game. In retrospect, gaming enthusiasts and historians have credited Pac-Man as a major factor in the drop of consumer confidence within the company, which would help contribute to the video game crash in 1983.
The home port of Space Invaders set the bar, but by 1982, the expectation for what the Atari should have provided for a home port of the game was a bit off. Some really liked the port, but there were many that were also disappointed. It all came down to the hardware lacking the ability to make a faithful port. But that was only part of the mentality from Atari, that really, the game doesn't need to be great, it's going to sell anyway, so let's just make it close enough. Thankfully, later ports would give us the game we deserve.
Years later, homebrew enthusiasts were able to create what possibly could have been in terms of a proper Pac-Man port. This homebrew title offers better sounds, but again not identical to the arcade, and appears to be a reskin of Ms. Pac-Man, which was done much better on the Atari 2600. Still, this is an impressive feat considering the hardware limitations of the 2600, and the fact they were able to get it to look even this close is very impressive. Atari, though, would acknowledge the shortcomings of the 2600, as when they were coming out with their new console, the Atari 5200, it would get a completely redone Pac-Man, and it was a lot better done on the much more capable system. It's still not arcade perfect, but it does a much better job than the 2600. Atari would even go so far as to call out the ColecoVision's version of Pac-Man as being much more inferior to the 5200's version. And that's hilarious because it is the 2600 version of Pac-Man that could be run on a ColecoVision through the adapter that plays 2600 games. However, for the 1980s, I think the closest port they got to arcade quality was the Nintendo Entertainment System version. This port was published by Tengen, which had a lawsuit against Nintendo for making unauthorized games on their system. Strangely, Tengen published a licensed version in 1988 and an unlicensed version in 1989. But eventually it would be published by Namco themselves. Still, this would be the most faithful port up until this point, and during a time when Pac-Man was still seen as a very relevant game.
Alright, we could spend much more time on this game and barely scratch the surface, but for now, this is where I'm going to leave it. Maybe we'll talk about Ms. Pac-Man and its development later on in this series, and that release in itself is very strange. But for now, we're just going to leave it here. That said, if you do like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Leave a comment below, let me know what you liked about today's video. Let me know what your favorite Pac-Man memory is from back in the arcades back in the day. As always, I want to thank you all so much for watching. Stay tuned because I have more content coming, and I will see you all in the next one.
If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Also, if you enjoy the content of this channel, please remember to click on this subscribe button. Again, I want to thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.